good to see everybody here this morning. If you have your Bibles with you, please turn to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1. Verse 1. And it reads, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Genesis chapter 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And as we move into our second part of our Understanding Faith in Unbelieving Time series, we need to understand that the most important question in your life and in my life is, does God exist? Because if God exists, then that changes everything about your life. And if God does not exist, that changes everything about your life. The question of does God exist is paramount to understanding not just if God exists, but whether or not Christianity is really true. And so this morning I'd like to open up with a story. One that I don't tell too often, but one that I think keys into this very question, and specifically what we're going to look at this morning. I can remember about 11 years ago it is now. And we were riding the roads of Iraq. I was in the top of a turret, a Humvee. And everything was going well. And then all of a sudden I heard this loud boom off to the left. And as I felt the heat from the explosion and I felt the reverberations of that boom, I ducked below the turret to make sure that nothing got me. I raised myself up out of that turret to look for a runner, to see if anybody had set off the improvised explosive device that had just went off. And as we communicated with the crew, we made sure that everybody was okay. We made sure the vehicles behind us were okay, and we kept pressing forward. And I was so relieved that several hours later, I would hear the opening and the screeching of the south gate as we moved in, and as the sand and the dust from the vehicles in front of me blew into my face, and as we heard the crunching of the gravel as we moved through the compound, and as the driver backed us into our designated spot, Corporal Key looked at me and he came and he said, "Hey, make sure this vehicle is okay." And I promise you, there were times in Iraq where I just simply went through the motions of checking the vehicle and went through the motions of cleaning the weapon. I combed every single inch of that vehicle. But before that, as the gravity of the moment began to penetrate my mind, as the weight of what had just taken place settled in, I took off my Kevlar, I undid my flak jacket, and there's only one noise that came from my mouth. As I set my flak jacket to the right side of the turret, and I draped my flak jacket over the left side of the turret, I hopped up onto that vehicle. And for 1 minute, I sat down and I peered into the sky. And I just started counting. 1 star, 2 stars. Is that a star or a planet? Wait, maybe they're both. I don't know. And I just kept counting. And it called me back to this question of how did all that get there? Because here I was in the middle of nowhere. Here I was kind of in between whether I believe this Christianity thing was true or not. And in a moment like that, an instance in life that was unexpected caused me to reflect on the question of how did the universe come into existence? And that's what we're going to answer this morning, because in Genesis chapter 1:1, it affirms that in the beginning God created both the heavens and the earth. And as we seek to understand our faith, as we seek to understand this question as well, why do we believe what we believe about Christianity? And as we seek to connect to the outside world, simply pointing to Genesis 1:1 and say, because the Bible tells me so. Or simply saying, that's the way that I was raised. Remember lesson 1 from last week. Or simply saying, that's just all I've ever known, may get us far within the walls of this building, may reinforce our belief about our Christianity with those who think the same way that we do, but may not gain traction with people who don't think the same way that we do. And so if we're going to talk about this thing called faith, and if we're going to understand this thing called Christianity, we have to understand that our faith begins with the beginning of the universe. For the beginning of the universe, if Genesis 1 is correct, the very first miracle that was ever performed by God was the creation of the heavens and the earth and all of the things that we see in the universe. And so if that's true, then there is a God that is real. There is a God that is personal. There is a God that is powerful, and there is a God that is eternal. But if it's not true, if Genesis 1:1 is not true, that means the parting of the Red Sea isn't true. That means the very lesson that we looked at this morning in Bible class, the calling down of fire at Mount Carmel, is also not true. That means the manna that rained down from heaven as Israel wandered in the wilderness is not true. It means that the miracles that took place at the Feast of Cana with Jesus turning water into wine is not true. It means that Jesus walking on water is not true. And it means that the resurrection, a miracle, is also not true. And so the question this morning is, how do we figure this out? How do we understand and how do we communicate not just to our brothers and sisters that believe the same thing that we do, but how do we communicate to the outside world that yes, God did create the universe without saying, it's the way I was raised. It's what the Bible says. Now, if you're taking notes, you're going to want to write these three things down. There's a simple pattern and a simple form that we can follow to show that the universe was created by God. And the first thing that we're going to write down is line of reasoning number 1. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. Second line is the universe had a beginning. And then the third line is, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now let's look at number 1. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. That just seems intuitively correct. I mean, if there were nobody here, and if there were just you, and you walked in, and you pulled into the driveway, and you saw this massive building, and you walked into this building, and you saw this beautiful roof with these beautiful lights and these padded pews, would anybody say, look what time did? Or would we intuitively look at what has been constructed, at what's here, and we would say, there's a designer behind that. If you walked along the beach, and I don't know, let's just say you found a Bible, and nobody else was around, would anybody say, man, look what the waves and the sand and the wind over time created. Would anybody say, as they open this book and as they flip through the pages and they look at the binding and look at this black ink on white paper, would anybody say, you know what? That just randomly happened. Now, there are people in the scientific community and in our society that believe that the universe popped into existence out of nothing. Now, the question we have to ask behind that is, if it's possible for the universe to pop into existence out of nothing, why doesn't everything, as big and as vast as the universe is, you know what? Now that I check, I'm a little light in my wallet. Why doesn't a $100 bill just pop into existence out of nothing into my wallet? I mean, I could surely use it. And I'm sure you could too. For those of us that are teenagers that play video games, I'm sure that you would love to have the brand new video game that's out, or an Xbox One or a PS4 just randomly pop into existence out of nothing. I'm sure some of us who want to raise at work, that would just pop into existence out of nothing and just show up in the bank account tomorrow. But does that really happen? No. And if that could happen with the universe, and as vast and as big as the universe is, why could that happen? Why does that just happen with the universe, but not with the minuscule and small things in life? And think about what that would mean for even the setting here now. Is anybody here this morning worried that as you listen to the words that I'm saying, or as the songs that we sing, that once you're done here, that as soon as you hit those doors that lead to the parking lot, that randomly, out of nothing, a white Siberian tiger is going to appear and devour you whole? Anybody worried about that? Or maybe when you get home and you get to the door and you open up the door, are you worried this morning that there's going to be a lion and a pack of lions waiting to devour you at your home? No, you're not. You want to know why you're not? Because you know that things don't pop into existence out of nothing. And if that doesn't happen on the smaller level, if that doesn't happen in everyday life, then why would we assume that it happened with the universe? Maybe the reason why people think that the universe popped into existence out of nothing is not because science shows it, but because they're trying to escape something. Better yet, maybe they're trying to escape someone. Maybe they're trying to escape God. And so we see from scientific evidence and we see from everyday experience that line reasoning number one, everything that has a beginning has a cause, is absolutely positively true. We see that in scientific verification. We see that in everyday experience. And so line reasoning number two would be that the universe had a beginning. So how can we show that outside of just simply quoting Genesis 1:1? Well, modern scientific discoveries have shown that the universe absolutely positively had a beginning. We see that in the early 1900s, Albert Einstein, with a theory of general relativity, predicted either an expanding universe or a contracting universe. And not too many years after that, Alexander Friedman and George Lemaitre took Einstein's equations and predicted an expanding universe. And then in 1929, and you guys know this name, a guy by the name of Edwin Hubble, as he observed and he's looked at the distant stars and the distant galaxies, he noticed something. he noticed that in every single direction that he looked, planets and galaxies were moving away. And so it showed that the universe was expanding. You might be asking, why is that significant? For instance, let's pretend you had a balloon and you had really small buttons on there and you super glued them to that balloon. What would happen when you blew that balloon up? What would happen to those buttons? Those buttons would expand and grow further and further apart. And so what Edwin Hubble showed is that that's exactly what's happening with the universe. And as the air retracts from that balloon, those buttons get closer and closer together until there's one point where they're all there. And in the early 2000s, Alexander Vilenkin, Arvin Board, and Alan Guth showed that any universe that's been in expansion throughout its history has to have a beginning. Alexander Vilenkin, an agnostic by admission, showed that it is impossible, his words, not mine, showed that it is impossible for scientists to get away from the universe having a beginning. And if you asked him, he'd say he's not so sure about Christianity. Therefore, line of reasoning number 3 follows that anything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore it must have a cause. And what's so important about that is the following, is that we know that the materials that make up the pews that you sit in could not make itself. These pews did not make itself. The wood didn't fashion itself, and the cloth didn't fashion itself so that it would become a pew. Somebody outside of the material that made these pews fashioned these pews. Somebody outside of the materials that make a car developed the car. When you walk across and you see a massive anthill, you know that something outside of that anthill made that anthill. Therefore, what is ever makes up the universe did not create itself, but are characteristics of something outside of itself. So what does that mean? That means that if the universe is made up of time, space, and matter, that means whatever created the universe is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. And the fact that it created the universe means that it is powerful. And it is also personal. And you might ask the question, why would it be personal? It's personal because at the beginning of the universe, there are no initial laws of operation, which means someone had to choose to start the process. Now, I don't know about you, but something that's timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and has the ability to choose sounds a lot like God. And so because of this, because of those facts, you and I can know, you and I can show that even if we never had a Bible in our possession, we could communicate to the outside world that God exists. That even the first miracle that is seen in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, is true on the basis of what we see and observe in the universe. And the question that we would have to ask anybody with regards to that is this: if those 3 lines of reasoning are true, why run? Why ignore the evidence? Because if Genesis 1:1 is true, than those miracles that we talked about, that we see in the Bible? The parting of the Red Sea, manna from heaven, turning water into wine, making blind people see, making deaf people hear, raising people from the dead. A son that is all human and all God is possible. And it also shows maybe not the first miracle, but the most important miracle, the raising of Jesus from the dead, is not just possible, it's most plausible. And if God exists, then it changes everything about your life and about my life. And as we move through this series, I hope that you take these notes, and I hope that you take what we give and apply it to the people on the outside. Because here's the thing, for so long, so many people, when they look at the church, they say, you know what, those people are old-fashioned, they're hokey, and they only believe what they believe because that's the way that they've been raised. See, what wins a war is the ability for the person who is on the opposition is to go into enemy territory and defeat the ideas there. And if we can take what we've learned and we can go out into society and we can apply these things to the skeptics and we can meet the skeptics on their own turf and show them that everything that has a beginning has a cause, the universe has a cause, therefore the universe had a beginning, then guess what? They can see the evidence for God. And so this morning I want to ask a question of us. We see the evidence. And are we willing to take the evidence into awkward, weird, even maybe aggressive territory to share it? And if we're willing to do that, and if we're willing to understand why we believe, what we believe, we can arm ourselves not just for the sake of society, but for the sake of the church, for the sake of our children, and for the sake of our grandchildren. No longer will young people and people in the church go off to college and learn something that they never learned in the church and apply it and lead them down the road of apostasy. That's what I want for us. That's what I hope you want for your own family. And it all starts in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Because the beginning of our faith starts with the beginning of the universe. And this morning, maybe you've been running from God. Maybe you're in a situation where you haven't necessarily had exposure to all of the evidence. I hope that you stick with us for the next several weeks. And maybe this morning you've just been distant from God. And He wants you to know that He's creator, He's sustainer, and that He's Savior. And if that's something that you need to respond to this morning, let's go ahead and do that now as we stand and as we sing.